Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location, and I'm here as so often with my good friend and colleague Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location. We are recording tonight's event for future broadcast on YouTube. So at any point that you might have questions, please type them in the Q&A box. You can find that at the bottom of your screen or in the chat. We'll monitor that too. And then we'll pose them at the end of tonight's event. And finally, before I turn things over to Rachel to introduce our authors tonight, just a note of thanks. It's independent book selling is a hard business in the best of times, and the last couple of years have not been. So Northshire owes its continued existence to your support, and we greatly appreciate it. All right, Rachel, take things away.
I am so very pleased tonight to get to be the one to welcome Susannah Mintz to our screens to talk about her most recent book, Love Affair in the Garden of Milton. She is the author or co-editor of several scholarly works about disability, culture, and representation, life writing, and early modern literature. Her personal essays have appeared in Prairie Schooner, Writer's Chronicle, Nashville Review, and elsewhere. He is a professor of English at Skidmore College. She's joined tonight by Chad Davidson, professor of English and director of the School of the Arts at the University of West Georgia. He is the co-author of Analyze Anything, A Guide to Critical Reading and Writing, and of Writing Poetry, and the author of multiple poetry collections, including Unearthed and From the Fire Hills. Please join me in welcoming them to our screens this evening.
Thank you, Rachel. And, I was thinking about a way to start this, Susannah. I don't know if you remember, you probably do recall the beginning of Anna Karenina, more or less.
Yes, I read it so recently.
Really? Every happy family is the same. Every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way.
Yeah.
And so it struck me because, I was thinking about how we might start this. And, the book is, boy, if you had to boil it down, it's about the dissolution of a marriage, and it's about heartbreak.
Yeah.
But it's peculiar and particular to your circumstance, right? As all these are, as Tolstoy had it for Anna Karenina. There's your scholarly interests are coming in, and what you're teaching and what you're experiencing outside of that heartbreak, your interest in mindfulness and Buddhism and meditation, that all is filtering into this book that's ostensibly about heartbreak. But you say it better than that. Do you want to give just like an opening reading that just kind of not summarizes the book, but is a good entry level, a wade into it?
Sure. I can read a section of the intro that I think sort of coalesces much of what you're talking about, explains a little bit of how one thing led to another, in a way that I hope will explain how these different thematic arenas are handled in the book. And then I can say more about what that process was like for me in the actual writing of it. Because of course, I didn't know at the start of the work that all of that was going to become braided in the ultimate project. It was very much a process of discovery for me. But I'll read a little bit of the introduction and see if that makes some things clear. The love affair that rent my marriage apart didn't precisely end my marriage. We're legally separated, have lived apart for years, but we're not divorced. Grappling with that ambiguity is one endeavor of this book, what it means to be stuck, to carry on in conditions that defy category. I've had to adjust to the ongoingness of a limbo it's in my power to end, except that I can't decide that I want to. And limbo, too, that liminal holding space for the spiritually unassigned, is entirely the wrong term to describe a couple of atheists orbiting their failed marriage with gravitational pull. Behind the daily vacillations, the screeds against his wrongdoing, I sometimes orate aloud, and the defensive insistence that loving relationships can take all forms, lies a deeper motivation to set the heartbreak of separation in the context of mindfulness. Trauma had initiated a frantic search for meaning, for restoration, but experience is never that neat. We might feel encouraged to wander more freely if we truly believed we were tough enough to handle whatever arose. It's this concept of meandering to arrive at your proper destination that brings my story to the Garden of Milton. I was teaching Milton the first semester after I separated from my husband, and it's only a slight exaggeration to say that that experience saved me from a worse despair. There's a currency to Milton's work that resonates, not just for a scholar like me, but for anyone sunk low and searching, anyone whose life has gone off the plot, upheaved, as Milton would say, by turmoil and the loss of hope. Where do we turn for consolation, for repair, when a certain future disappears and our sense of the past becomes a convoluted entanglement of untruths? When the stories of ourselves, the comforting, well-worn narrative of who I am, no longer hold true, and if religion holds no explanatory truths. It's common to think of Milton as a Christian, if also revolutionary poet, whose major work trains our attention on the mistakes of hubris and overreaching, as well as the happy end, the promise of the good to come after so much destruction and trespass. But the title of Paradise Lost misleads us, purposely so and cleverly, if you consider that the point is to rethink what goal we have in mind when we're judged or judge ourselves for having strayed. What have we really lost if we're kicked out of a place that wasn't all that fulfilling to begin with? What satisfaction can come unexpectedly of hard work and renewed understanding between two people who failed each other so spectacularly? That's one of Milton's most radical implications. If we eschew notions of an afterlife altogether, everything is at stake only in this moment. If we quit our habits of framing, explaining, and containing, get out of our own way, maybe we allow ourselves to be more authentically astonished. Milton defended divorce, lambasted compulsory piety, limned a revolutionary Eve. His work demands that we think for ourselves at the perilous intersections of every moment of every day. It's dramatic and exciting and alive. That's what I clung to in the ghastly unreality of shock, of a beloved becoming entirely strange, and a sadness that threw all the old frameworks into disarray when the forward motion of my life yanked to a halt. Milton's endless ornate sentences, his lush poetic lines, his electrifying clarity of purpose, all figuring here as guides for how to think about the world turning upside down, because it will. We can try to reconstruct ourselves in the aftermath of chaos according to what we know, or we can unlearn ourselves completely, open to the possibility of otherwise. That was the extraordinary discovery of an otherwise lamentable autumn, all the world before me, where to choose. Here then is a tale of how we might elude the constraints of story, a tale about longing to believe when you have no faith in a God, about the trauma of infidelity when the absence of belief seems to deepen the reeling, disorienting pain of betrayal, about the lyric intensity of grief and the saving grace of verse, especially Milton's world-bending heresies and humanist convictions when nothing else seems to cohere, about teaching, even when you're rocked, a teacher of 30 years by a crisis of irrelevance, about dogs, friendship, conversation, travel, mindfulness, aging, choice, and happiness, all as forms of devotion to what Milton himself would cling to late in his career as ballast in the face of failed revolutionary zeal, learning how to live to the utmost of your know-how. And two, about accepting that the best life might just mystify all our certitudes and effort. Just the other night, I dreamt that my wedding dress was stained with ink, a black smudge that bloomed to purple and yellow and green as soon as I touched it with water.
I was struck by a couple of moments when you were reading that. Here then is a tale of how we might elude the constraints of story, and yet that appears in a nonfiction narrative, a story. About this heartbreak, right? Or if we quit our habits of framing, explaining, containing, get out of our own way, maybe we'll allow ourselves to become more authentically astonished. That too almost feels like what we might tell creative writing students. The the deferral of finality, the deferral of
Absolutely.
meaning, that you constantly defer the ending of an essay or a poem or a story or a novel because you want to be surprised and shocked at where it takes you.
Absolutely.
I think you would probably agree with me, right? That we rarely, if ever, start out knowing where it's going.
Most definitely. And it is the thing that writers starting out really worry about. I think there's that that presumption that we need to know the entire shape and that we should have some sense of where we're headed. That may be particularly true if we're coming to creative nonfiction from having written analytical or critical essays, where in some sense you do sort of need to know the argument, you kind of need to know where you're headed. But this is a form that really celebrates that process of discovery. And that was absolutely true for me here. I did not set out to write a book about Milton. I mean, I really sometimes, I don't quite understand how he got in here. He just infiltrated my consciousness. Some of that is obviously because I was teaching that semester, and that was so galvanizing to be. I mean, part of it was just the solace of being in a room of enlivened and really engaged students who were discovering Milton for the first time. And there's something so just so charged and so gratifying about talking to people about the ideas that matter to you through, in and through a writer that you really love. But for me, that semester, I realized that I was having an emotional, deeply psychological connection to Milton that I'd never had before. So then I was discovering all kinds of things about him in that process. I mean, the way in which he can be made to seem very Buddhist, very mindful, that was really a discovery. But I still didn't exactly set out to write about him. And I didn't exactly set out to write a book about the marriage per se. I wanted to investigate this question of belief. What does it mean to not believe in a strictly religious sense, but also to long for faith or to long for something spiritual because you might think that it will provide some solace. I have that longing, even though I sort of don't have the belief system. That conundrum really fascinated me. And so the first part of this that I wrote was actually the happiness chapter, the one that begins with my father telling me that religious people are happier than non-religious people. And I wanted to, put some pressure on that. Is that really true? Speaking as someone who would not really define myself as a happy human being, I wanted to test, is that really right? And that led me back to Milton, because as I say there in the intro, happiness, but even more this forms of happenstance are absolutely rife in Paradise Lost, maybe in all of his work. That very word, or words like happily, happenstance, happily, in the sense of things happening randomly by chance. It's only by chance that Satan, for example, ends up on earth because he plunges out of hell and a gust of wind lifts him back up to the Garden of Eden. How amazing, right? To think of a world in which cosmic events are actually happening randomly. And, and meanwhile, in my own life, not just in the separation, but then of course, a year later, the very traumatic disappearance of my dog, things were happening that felt highly unexpected, not exactly random, of course, right? Because there's two people involved who are making a thing work or not work. But it provided me a way sort of back into the poem with this renewed discovery of how Milton could actually matter to this very private anguish that I was going through. And then that began to feel really exciting. What else could I do with that convergence? Of course, when Jack went missing, when the dog got lost, the connection to the creation of the natural world in Paradise Lost was the obvious analog there. That book has always been one of my most favorite in the poem because the poetry itself is absolutely exuberant. I mean, it's gorgeous. Some of the best poetry, I think, in the whole epic. But what I really love about it is that Milton writes the creation of nature in such a way that seems to have absolutely nothing to do with sort of heavenly decree and everything to do with natural things just coming into being as if of their own accord, knowing exactly who they are and what they're supposed to be doing in their environments. Of course, that it was easy for me to make a connection to my little dog, running around in the frozen woods, right?
Yeah.
But then also, of course, what that meant for me as someone who was trying to figure out how do I live through this thing that I'm living through? What might it mean for me as a person trying to practice meditation and mindfulness to really deeply believe in having those resources within myself? But all of that, these events are separated by months and months. And so, yes, I absolutely had to write my way into figuring out how all of that could converge in a way that would be maybe true to the story that I felt like I was trying to tell, and also true to the various threads themselves, not to do Milton an injustice, to make him make a certain kind of sense.
Yeah. It's so funny. I think when we read books, or if you're not in the writing world and you're not in that practice and you're not in that sort of ritualistic space, I think even I'm guilty of it sometimes, just thinking of novels and memoirs and essay collections and poems being written down the page linearly, right, from start to finish.
Right.
And of course, if you do any thinking about it, if you just meditate on it, you understand that is almost never the case. And so one of my favorite in-class questions is what if it didn't start there? What if it started here? What if it started there? What if it ended there? Like, the shape is yours to create.
Yes.
And so you keep bringing up the dog, and so we go back to the beginning, and you read this gorgeous beginning where it's just about heartache and Milton and mindfulness and an atheist lost, searching for belief, or searching for something that could at least be tantamount to that.
Yeah.
And yet then when we turn to the first chapter, it's like a dog goes missing. Now, could you read a little bit of that? I think the part you're going to read though is after you find Jack, right? So you're not.
Yeah, I think I'm reading this excerpt comes from the very end.
Because it's a harrowing chapter, and I remember you reading that very early on, and it's riveting, but a lot of it has to do with his being lost.
Yes, right, because I think I read an early version of this in Italy, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It's a lot about him being lost, but it really, that whole episode really became sort of an object lesson for me in how quick we are to impose meaning on random event.
Sure.
And that, right, that I was trying to work those ideas into this project. Like, things just happen to us, and then how do we react to them? What do we bring to our cause? What do we rally to our aid? And what happens if we, right, again, like if we sort of relieve ourselves of the pressure of the stories we've been telling ourselves about who we are? Because meanwhile, along these years doing a lot of practice in mindfulness, I'm so sort of convinced that just is not always helpful for us. In fact, quite counterproductive. But there I was again, living through this moment where everybody wanted to make it meaningful. It was the feel-good story. It was all about lessons and happy endings.
Or it's a sign from God. If you were
it was a
believer,
sign from the universe. I was supposed to learn a lesson from him. So
anyway, so you're going to read a section.
I'm going to read a little bit. Okay.
Right. So spoiler alert, he is.
Okay. Jack got found, by the way. When Jack came back, and I could safely ponder what it had all meant, when I could turn off the flashlight and try to imagine him sniffing his way atop a crust of snow in pitch black woods without my heart stopping, when I could lean into meaning instead of guarding myself against the threat of grief, I felt only bafflement. I'd let out the lead and watch him script a Baroque curlicue from one side of the road to the other, U's and figure eights and punctuation marks of P, but it spelled nothing I could read. Did Jack get lost so that I would learn something I needed to know? There was a moment one night, home alone and numbed on Xanax and whiskey, when I wondered if the grand gesture of a man driving cross country through the limits of fatigue to get to me and not once getting mad at me for losing our beloved pup would be the thing to reunite us. And later, when he was there and the dog was there, and I remembered why we weren't together anymore, I wondered if that was the lesson, that Jack got lost to give me courage, to remind me of the strength that comes from knowing exactly what to do to care for yourself, no matter how harsh the conditions. Running for home against every conceivable odd, could there be anything more symbolic? But maybe Jack just got out. And then something else happened, and then something else. A series of events, this, then that, rather than this, so that. Milton staunchly denied a deterministic universe, but that doesn't mean Jack wasn't trying to get home, fed up with eluding campus safety and foraging for rabbit scat and pizza crusts. It doesn't mean Jack wasn't looking for me. I want to be in that world, in fact, one that has shape, but not design, where to behave intentionally is not the same as obedience and does not require the metaphysical operations of what else. I can choose to believe that Jack is a marvel of a dog and be a heretic in the truth, as Milton advocates in one of his political tracts for eschewing doctrinal compliance. There's something about amazement that in stunning us quiet seems then to impel us toward narrative arc. It's never enough to say what happened without context or point. Mustn't we do more than shake our heads and shrug at the sheer unbelievableness of life? Aren't we supposed to honor it, the sorrow and joy, by giving it a frame? There's no denying Jack as a good story. I could commodify Jack if I had that kind of imagination or initiative, if I knew how to parlay the good story into a children's book, a Broadway play, a movie, a line of merch. Think t-shirts, stuffed toys, the bobblehead dashboard terrier. One of the websites I visited during the ordeal of Jack reassured me that what I felt as the agonized uncertainty of his absence, my dog was most likely enjoying as a grand adventure. It broke my heart to think of him afraid and alone in the cold. And so I was consoled by the idea that at that very moment, while I was reeling from yet another moment of life turning on a dime, Jack was having the time of his life. What I was living through, he was simply in. The psychoanalysts call it going on being, this ability to withstand separations and loss and to accommodate the wild flux of experience. In Buddhism, it's presence. In dog, well, you get the point. It's occupying time as a matter of the perpetually imminent good that can happen. Jack was not narrating his experience to himself, imagining how he'd arrange the photos of his trip in the album or pre-writing postcards in his head to spin the tale for maximum effect. I was doing that for him, still am. Now I've enlisted you in the project because I worry I'll lose it otherwise. The moral of the story, which is that it's possible to inhabit yourself meaningfully without forcing any meaning at all. When a woman I didn't know handed me my soaking wet dog, who'd lost 20% of his body weight during his crazy caper, and I wrapped him in a pink fleece blanket adorned with white paw prints, I thought he did look a little stunned, as if to say, what the hell just happened? We rushed him to the vet, the man who isn't my husband and I, where it was determined that Jack had no cuts, no breaks, no dehydration or hypothermia, no injuries of any kind. He was, of course, massively fatigued, slept for most of the next 24 hours. And when he was awake, he did not let me out of his sight. I worry sometimes that I've hyper-cathected my dog, anthropomorphized him out of all canine recognition, transmitted to him my anxious attachment problems, my primal panic, and spoiled him. I trust you caught the detail of the pink fleece. But then I look at him, paws lined up like an Egyptian tapestry, and remember what he's capable of. Have you ever watched an animal catch sight of itself in a mirror? It couldn't care less who it is. I will never know exactly why Jack bolted from my care one frigidly cold day in December, or how he managed to survive weather, predators, starvation, or traffic. The mystery of it, no matter how much we try to contain it on the loom of making sense, can never be resolved in any ultimate way. There can only ever be the head-shaking wonder of it. And I wonder what it might be like to linger in that unknowing. I want to live in the fullness of 4 days in the woods, in the fullness of the 5th day when Jack rested, and I caught a glimpse of what it means to be so fully immersed in the medium of aliveness that you forget the luxuries of home. Or better, home takes on a whole new valence. I want to glide under the green wave, tower the mid-aerial sky. I wish, like Eve, a thing not undesirable, sometime to turn on the world my answering looks of love.
Yeah, and those quotes there at the end from Milton, so wonderful. You're like building toward that sort of lyric close. I love this line, what I was living through, he was simply living in.
Yeah.
And I wondered about maybe how you might discuss the writing of the book. I mean, is that a record of having lived through, or is that a kind of mindful activity of living in, as you're writing this, ongoing, I think, record of obsessions, teaching Milton, mindfulness, Jack being lost. You don't want to make sense of it, but it's hard not to aggregate those details. I mean, where is writing in all this, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I'm thinking of what you were saying earlier on, where I thought you were going to sort of catch me in the fact that I claim to want to get outside of story in the very sentence where I say, here's a tale, I'm telling you a story.
Yeah, exactly.
More than one reader has sort of said, like, I think you're doing the very thing that you keep claiming not to do. And to some extent, that's the point. We don't ever get out of it. We can try to become more alert to it and maybe interrupt those tendencies. Your question makes me think of a class that I did some years ago, and more recently a summer thing that I've done with my former colleague and very best friend Susan Walder on mindfulness and memoir. The question is it possible to bring together these two things that seem antithetical? Mm-hmm. One is sort of, can we just exist in a moment without constantly rehearsing the past, fantasizing about the future? Can we open ourselves to this beautiful present moment of just existing? Mm-hmm. And write memoir, which is defined by memory, sort of therefore the past, and by this consolidated self. I'm not sure about that. Maybe that, like most things, is sort of aspirational. Certainly in the process of it, I was trying very hard to keep alert to my own bad habits, I guess, to keep trying to sort of get out of my way as a person who thinks about things and as a person who maybe has writing habits, something like that. I didn't know, as you asked before, I did not know where this was going to end. And I will acknowledge that there was a kind of deliberate, right? I had the idea that to write a collection of truly disparate essays probably wasn't going to fly in the current marketplace. So there was a way in which I was searching for through lines, because I felt that thematically connected pieces would just sell better. And I wasn't really interested in trying to sit down and write a book-length memoir, because I'm just more comfortable in the particular size and form of an essay. So yeah, I had some idea about where I was going. It was driven by certain ideas, but I think I did keep trying to sort of, I don't know, make myself accountable to the very ideas that I was trying to espouse or investigate.
It's funny. I say sometimes in class, we don't choose our obsessions; they choose us. So the idea that when you're writing about Jack, it seems fitting and also natural that a lot of the themes and the sort of obsessions that you're going through find their way into ostensibly an episode in your life that may well have had nothing to do, as you say, it's happenstance that he happened to get lost
Right,
while your estranged husband happened to be away. It's all of these things
right,
are happening
right.
as happenstance. Where were you in the writing, just not to get too in the weeds here, but where were you in the writing of this when it dawned on you that this would be the beginning, like this would be a sort of key entry into this longer text about Milton and heartbreak? Or
I'm
was that
laughing.
just sort of luck or happenstance
It
itself?
wasn't really I mean, I'm laughing because in one way it's because that essay got published and I thought
You got to have the published one in there.
this is the last best thing I'll ever write. I think the truer answer is that that episode and all that it seemed to reveal in terms of this very question of what it means to try to live so inside ourselves and in the moment, to have so much trust, right? To really, I mean, I love to think of it this way, to just know that the 99% of your DNA that is wolf can sort of handle whatever happens to you. That seemed so core to what I think I was trying to do in interweaving the private story, the Milton, the philosophical Buddhism. It kind of had to begin with Jack.
Yeah.
And then, Jack became something of an avatar. I mean, yeah, he shows up elsewhere. He closes the book for me because he just he embodies the very thing. That, I mean, it's sort of a cliche, I guess, about animals living in the moment, but I watched him do that in that experience of getting lost.
Yeah. It's another maybe an occupational hazard of teaching nonfiction. You've probably experienced this too. I've taught lots of poetry workshops, and you do come in contact with trauma that students have experienced and lived through, or heartbreak, all of these things. But oftentimes composition of poetry for them often is encoded with a kind of a special veneer, and it's a particular kind of heightened language. So oftentimes it's blurry what you're seeing, in a way that nonfiction, well, the occupational hazard is that you just come face on with despair and heartache and violence and harassment and all these just ugly human features. And so I find myself kind of thinking, I'm not a therapist and writing isn't therapy.
Yes.
Although it's also absurd to think that it isn't. Like, to completely eschew that possibility that writing is somehow redemptive and therapeutic is a tricky matter. And so I was wondering if you might want to talk about that a moment. Like, this book, you could see it being very helpful to people working through their own versions of heartbreak, but that's not, I don't think, your intention. And I don't know if it could ever be the intention of a literary nonfiction.
Right. There's so much embedded in what you're talking about, because part of what you're talking about are sort of the dynamics of the workshop setting and how delicately we must handle the things that get disclosed in writing. And maybe another part of that is also the question of, I'm always talking to students about aesthetic distance, that sometimes we just can't and maybe shouldn't be writing about things that are too raw for us. Maybe we could in a purely sort of cathartic way, but
like diary writing that no one ever sees. Yeah.
Something that externalizes experiences and feelings in a way that can be incredibly useful, but that might be different from what it means to transform experience into the artifact, to make art from it, which I think typically requires a certain kind of aesthetic distance. I think really both of these things were happening for me with this particular project. I mean, in shorter forms, I have often felt that writing the essay, however long it takes me to do that, and I've written essays right up close to experience, and I've written essays that took me decades and decades away from the thing that happened. So it can really vary. I've certainly had that experience that when I finally get the thing onto the page, into the writing, it allows me to move ahead. I'm able to turn that page. It can have a really profound, almost immediate effect of a kind of closure. And I think that happens here. It's interesting, early readers, and you may have been one of them, Chad, wanted more marriage. And I will acknowledge that I had a really hard time with that. That felt very dangerous to me. I felt exposed. It was a painful risk to take. I resisted it for a long time. Some people might still want more marriage. I did as much as I could in the moment. That was also about protecting the privacy of other people in the book. I did not want to write an expose, so I was having to manage certain boundaries for myself, for others. That got a little bit delicate, but nonetheless, being inside of all of these ideas and kind of living with myself and my private pain through Milton and through the process of making sentences out of it, there's no question that had a kind of progressive effect for me, that I was somewhere else emotionally when I got to the end of the manuscript than I was at the beginning. That's definitely true.
Yeah, and it's interesting you're talking about progressing through, and it is, there's a narrative arc to this, there is a narrative arc to the marriage that we're watching kind of fall apart. But by the end of the book, I think it was kind of curious, you actually do travel. So there is actual travel here too, not the sort of figurative, metaphorical, imaginative travel.
Right.
And of all places, you end up in Italy. And so
it's not really of all places.
Of all places. Well, I will say that Susannah and I take part in a conference every summer. Or it has been. How many years has it been now for you?
5 years.
5 years straight. And I've come to sort of rely on her. She's not allowed not to come anymore. She must be there. And I've learned a great deal from her. But it's funny, when I first saw that piece in the book, I encountered it the first time in your manuscript.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, oh boy, it's touchy, right? Because you have all of the cliches come so easily. I mean, how many narratives do we have of someone in a situation of heartbreak, rediscovering herself or himself, usually herself, in Italy? It's usually gendered. It's usually sort of like, I'm going to go to Italy and find myself. And Italy is this sort of locus of romantic fulfillment and self-actualization and all of this. And so I wondered if maybe you might read that section for us.
Yeah.
We could talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls that you were able to navigate.
I will do, and I hope that I pronounce Kasia correctly. But
Kasia,
got it. Okay. So this is a section from the chapter about going to Italy, and the conversation that's invoked in the very first sentence of this refers to a conversation that I had with another ex. I mean, because part of this book really is about holding on to people who have defined us over our lives, who've helped us grow up, and to figure out ways of keeping love in our lives, whatever those relationships look like. So I'm referring to a conversation that I had in Italy with someone that I have known for a very, very long time. I like to think this conversation could only have happened in Italy, where the phases of our lives concertina, and we can call upon our mutual past to offer solace for the woes of our respective presents. Or maybe it just makes sense in Italy, where I feel so acutely that loss of a certain kind of life For another, I can't foresee. Well, certainty about the arc of life is always an illusion, as Milton also understood. His own time in Italy was cut short by the death of his beloved friend Charles Diodati back home, as well as by impending civil war. Did Milton know, as I learned from reading de Botton, that's Alain de Botton, that spirits from the coastline south of Naples were thought to be particularly well suited to the abatement of melancholy? How did I not know until now that unhappily married women went to Umbria to visit the shrine of Saint Rita of Cascia, patron saint of marital problems? When I look up Saint Rita, I discover that there's a national shrine to her in Philadelphia, my hometown, adjacent to the hometown of my ex. Can I admire that convergence without believing in Rita as a saint? De Botton, who had the inspired idea of writing a whole book while and about sitting in an airport, says that travel can salve the wounded parts of us, even if we're not on spiritual pilgrimage. Can an atheist travel to heal, not just to be entertained or to escape? Milton did not abandon his eclectic protesting beliefs during his sojourn in Catholic Italy. He just made room for other pleasures and pursuits, got out of the way, so to speak, of the self he was becoming. Umbria, then, my garden, my revelation. I haven't wanted to rehearse the travel transcendence paradigm, the whole Tuscan sun, eat, pray, whatever cliche of a heartbroken woman who discovers herself in the redemptive balm of dislocation, losing weight on a diet of sumptuous local fare, stumbling her way towards fast friendships in a language she doesn't speak, getting geographically lost in tiny villages to find her spiritual way. But all right, meeting the man of your dreams aside, some experiences do distill down to pure joy. For a woman so suspicious of happiness that the very word smacks my ears like the sound of a plastic kazoo, Umbria is another of my versions of the ecstasy of faith. As for these men of the past, I can't quite quit them. Or maybe it's better to just keep posing the question, do I need to? We think of our stories as linear, and we crave them to help ourselves make sense, for solace and closure and freedom from guilt. But they're circular too, looping and recursive, like those tiny paw prints in the snow of the dog Jack, not at all lost, but exploring, delighting in it, Jack on his own grand tour, and only eventually, when he got tired, making his way home, a home that had a new cat in it instead of a man. Milton returned from Italy revivified and mature, ready to take on a career of philosophical intensity that would be shaped by war, complicated by marriage, ultimately defined by a steadfast conviction and a headlong tilt into verse. Most lives are humbler than that, of course, tangled up in ordinary disappointments, only occasional joys. Most of us are losing our bearings, dismantling ourselves, searching, aching, you might say, for what to believe and how to know it. The transcendent sense of belonging I've felt at the conference in Umbria evaporates inexorably once I'm home again, restored to the usual routines of a life. That's just what travel is like. But I can carry this consolation secure within me, as Eve will say at the end of her tale, that I once sat down to a meal in Umbria, surrounded by acceptance and laughter, and there I was.
Oh, it's just so beautiful. And I will attest to the fact that once you come back from Umbria, you kind of disappear back into your routine, and I don't hear from you except for little very, very slight messages to me. But
that's because you're always in you're always in Rome, Chad, for another 6 to 8 weeks.
That's such a gorgeous way to end this reading, I think.
Thank
And
you.
I know you've got a lot of questions that people want to ask you. So do we want to turn over to those questions?
Thank you, Chad.
Yeah, we have some great ones. The first one that came in was from Hannah, asking, how did you decide on narrative structure? How did you decide on the order of the chapters and the structure? Thanks.
What a tough question. I mean, Chad, can you answer that question for me?
I don't know how you did it, but I
I don't
sort
know
of
how I
feel like
did it.
you start with individual essays, and then after a little while you begin to see a narrative arc emerge, but we're
Yeah,
never quite, it's very inchoate, to use your word. You love that word.
I do love that word. I do think there's a kind of natural progression. If it makes sense to believe, if others believe with me that it makes sense to have started with the Jack chapter, I knew at some point early on I had to have a chapter about teaching, because that had happened so much at the beginning of all of this. And it too sort of sets up some thematics that I think extend through the book. I knew because of these themes I started to playing with, that I had to have a chapter on mindfulness. At some point in all of this, I went to Italy and read some things. And of course, Milton himself had a grand, year and a half Italy excursion. There was a point at which I actually imagined myself following Milton's footsteps. I think that's now been done by Joe Mashenka, whose book just came out sort of around the same time. But the idea of traveling to allowing for these questions about what it means to be ourselves, and how we might occupy ourselves, inhabit ourselves differently, that just seemed like a natural, that had to be in there too, something natural about that. And then I guess maybe I started to think about that maybe other people were reading chapters and ideas began to form in my mind. A chapter on aging and dying made sense to me because of where I am personally in the trajectory of my life, and what it means to me to be on the other side of this rupture in my life as a middle-aged woman, right?
Mhm.
And I think all along, one of the things that really fascinates me about Milton's imagery is that there is so much reference to hand holding, or to that particular sort of emblematic force of that kind of lateral side-by-side reciprocal physical contact of people holding hands. So I knew that there had to be a hand. I've written about hands in other contexts. I knew there had to be something about hands. Maybe hands seemed like the place to end. I don't know. I felt my way through based on how it was putting itself together. I think of these things as faceted, and we're just steadily building them.
Yeah, aggregations, right?
Aggregations,
You
exactly.
must think small, think
Yeah,
small, think locally.
absolutely.
You can't think of the book writ large. You think in tiny chunks and aggregate them.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely right.
Thank you. There's a question here from Madison. She asks, when did it click for you that Milton's work could be applied to so many of your pieces? Was it in rereading his work that you put the pieces together? Or did those connections occur as you reflected on how best to share your personal events with an audience?
Again, I think it really began in the semester when I was teaching him and actually going through this private grief. Part of what happened, this is sort of explained in the teaching essay. I realized that I was reading Milton a little bit differently. So the intellectual ideas were familiar to me. I had worked with them many times before, but they took on a very acute personal, emotional weight for me. And I got excited about what it would mean to engage with a writer outside of a kind of scholarly control. Just, what does it mean to realize that you've lived with a writer for so long that the writer is actually inside of you? Because there's something about criticism, of course, it's a little bit about control, maybe mastery of the text or something like that. And part of what I was realizing in the teaching of it in this moment, and you know, as I say in that chapter, there were times when I actually had to make sure I didn't start crying in front of my students. I mean, it was very intense. And I just realized Milton is in here. I have absorbed so many of his ideas and also my ideas about him, about what life is, about what intimacy means, about what honesty can be, about how people, any people, find their way back to each other after they have absolutely destroyed the thing that they were trying to do. That was all, even his divorce track, I mean, obviously his divorce tracks, it was all just hitting me in a very different sort of way. And I think that helped me to understand that Milton could become part of this book in a way that I had not initially anticipated. And then once I realized that, then I started looking for connections and was really surprised to find them, many more than I had anticipated.
Our next question came in from Eamon asking, I'm wondering what you're writing.
I recognize all these names, by the way.
I'm wondering what your writing practice looks like. You try to sit down daily or more when inspiration strikes?
Yes, good question. So my thing has been for a very long time to try, if you can, to make contact every day. I am not a person who sits down and writes my 600 words every morning. I have many friends in the world who really are diligent about that. And I just, maybe over summer I can work that way, but you know, during a semester, not at all. But if I'm in the groove of a thing, I guess what I try to do is make some contact. And sometimes what that means is I just reread a paragraph or two. But what I think happens is if you can make that contact really consistently, then some part of your mind is engaged in the work, you know, sort of semi-consciously, so that when you have time to sit down and write for an hour or two, you're not starting from scratch. But I certainly have long, fallow periods where I lie on my couch and despair that I will never write again. I mean, that happens to me. You know, I guess over the years, I've learned that I can allow those fluctuations to happen without getting too freaked out about it. But I think the daily making contact, if you can do that, read something, jot down some notes, reread a thing, switch a word or two, it just kind of keeps the stuff fomenting in your mind in a way that helps you to be more productive when you have more time or more energy.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're getting close to the end, but there is still one more question from Barbara, and she says, two different questions, actually. Take the one you like. How has this book changed the way you teach Milton, or what are you writing next?
I can answer the second question really quickly. I'm writing a book about hypochondria, which I'm very excited about. So sort of going back to the scholarly piece, although because I have been a hypochondriac since I was a little kid and thought I had, you know, yellow fever because I was reading about the Quakers in Philadelphia. There will be it will be personally inflected, I think. I'm excited about that. But the way I teach Milton, yeah, so I just had another Milton class last semester. The book was just coming out, and I wanted to invite my students to sort of to develop their own relationships to him exactly as I had. So I foregrounded this at the very beginning of the semester, that this is, yes, I'm here as your teacher. I'm responsible for helping you to understand Milton as a thinker in his particular historical moment, why he matters to literary history. But there's also something else we can do with these writers that isn't necessarily about those things and is no less real and live and exciting. And it's part of what makes maybe particularly older literature really relevant for us. He can matter, you know, to a 20-year-old having their own struggles about what this life is like and how to inhabit it. So I think I've tried to open up that space of letting the writer into these private recesses of ourselves. It's not a way that we maybe talk about teaching literature all the time, but it feels important to me, maybe really urgent in this particular moment when lives are incredibly difficult. And I became, I mean, again, to that question of sort of the process of the writing, I was even having taught Milton over all of these years, I think I myself was a little surprised at how much Milton means to me. But I had to figure that out by coming at him in this entirely different, from this entirely different direction. And I wanted to offer that to my students.
That sounds like a remarkable class and a beautiful note to end on.
Thank you.
Susannah and Chad, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. This has been absolutely fascinating and really lovely. Audience, thank you so much for being here. You can order Susannah's book and Chad's at northshire.com or come into the store to pick it up. Thank you all so much for being here and for your incredible support of independent bookselling.
Thank you so much to both of you and to Chad and to everybody who's here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you and good night, everybody.